All right, up to this time, in this course, most of the time we've been talking about market success. Most of the time, that is, we leave the market to itself and good things happen. That happened, for example, in the perfectly competitive model. What I want to talk about in the next few videos is about market failure, which is, as the name implies, situations where markets don't work well, where they in fact fail. So the idea here is that there are some contexts where we wouldn't really expect markets to generate efficient outcomes. Now, this isn't entirely new to us. We did see deadweight loss in monopoly before. Remember, when we had a monopoly, a single price monopoly in particular, that guy chose the quantity where marginal revenue equaled marginal cost, and at the resulting choice, there was a little triangle of deadweight loss. So we have seen situations where markets can generate inefficient outcomes. But we're going to see some more. And the point to, I think, make here is that sometimes these market failures create a role for government. It's also the case that sometimes these market failures create opportunities for entrepreneurial activity. I mean, particularly as new technologies come along and make it possible to solve some market failures through private action. But we'll see some of that as we go. So some specific kinds of contexts where markets wouldn't necessarily work are going to be public goods, which we'll talk about, externalities that we'll talk about, as well as asymmetric information that we'll talk about as we go here. We should note, though, that in a modern market economy, government really has three different roles. One is, you might say, the rule maker and umpire. Even people who are let's say, very pessimistic about government and think government should be limited as much as possible tend to agree that you still need a government to make the rules and enforce them. So that's this sort of, quote, rule maker and umpire role. And you can think about institutions like the law, like courts, like property rights, like police, as these rule maker and umpire functions. A second kind of role, a bit more controversial, but certainly something that public policy can do, is to correct market failures, correct situations where markets left to themselves deliver inefficient outcomes. That's the sort of thing we'll be talking about in this module. Another role for government, and this just as a matter of fact is true, that government does engage in redistribution. Some people have different views about whether government should, but it surely is true that government does engage in redistribution. So what I'd like to do is to spend a little time in this video talking about the distribution of income. Historically, talking about this topic has had the flavor of kind of making rich people feel guilty, but I think there's much more interesting stuff happening when we look at the income distribution and how it's changed over time. So this isn't just a sort of preaching guilt to the rich, but instead I think that there's some very interesting current events here to talk about. So first of all, three facts about inequality. One fact is that income and wealth distributions tend to be unequal. No surprise there. Different people have different amounts of stuff. A second fact, though, that gets more toward sort of a new fact is that the wealth distribution tends to be much more unequal than the income distribution. Now, why is that? Well, what's wealth? Wealth is sort of leftover accumulated income, and it gets passed on through generations. So wealth tends to become much more unequally distributed than income. A third fact is that the income distribution has grown much more unequal over time in the U.S. Now, I'll show you a little bit more about these facts in the next few slides. But first, I want to introduce a tool that we use for thinking about inequality. And that tool is called the Lorenz curve. Now, what the Lorenz curve does is that it relates the cumulative percentage of individuals to the cumulative percentage of income or wealth. So, for example, in this picture, on the x-axis, we have the cumulative percent of individuals, goes from 0 up to 100. On the y-axis, we have the cumulative percent, let's say, of income or wealth, which of course goes from 0 up to 100. Now, the 45-degree line, the black line that goes from here to here, that's the line that would represent the distribution of income or wealth if everybody had the same amount. Then, for example, at any point along this axis, let's say this is 10, or I guess that's more like 20% of the way, we'd say the bottom 20% of people have 20% of wealth. But If it's not equal, if the distribution of income is not equal, then the representation of that distribution will be on this red kind of lens-shaped line. And so what we're saying is that, for example, the bottom X% of people have Y% of income or wealth, where notice that Y is a lot smaller than X, right? If we can go up to here, back over to here, here's X. So that's if the distribution of income or wealth were equal, it would be represented by this straight line. But if the bottom, let's say in this case, it looks like X is about 60%, so if the bottom 60% of people have something like 20% of income or wealth, then the dot's way down here. Now by construction, the bottom 0% of people have 0% of stuff, and the bottom 100% have 100% of stuff, so we know that the endpoints of this curve are here and here, but where we are in between depends on how unequal the distributions are. The point is that with a Lorenz curve, the farther the curve is from the 45-degree line, the more unequal the distribution is. So, a curve that looks like that isn't very unequal, whereas a curve that looks like that is very unequal. Let's take a look at some recent data, relatively recent data for the U.S., and these are Lorenz curves showing income and wealth distributions across a couple of different years for the U.S. Now, the point I want to focus on in this diagram is that these curves, represented here, are income Lorenz curves, whereas these curves over here are wealth Lorenz curves. Wealth is much more unequally distributed than income. We said that before, and here you can see it as data. Okay, so how would one read this? Well, here, for example, is 60%. So think of this as 60% of families. If you ask how much wealth or income does the bottom 60% of families have? Well, in income terms, the bottom 60% has about 20% of income. The bottom 60% of families in wealth terms has about 5%, something like that. This is about a 5 over here. This is 20 over here. We could do this little exercise at 80% too. Here's an 80. The bottom 80% of families have, well, it looks like it's about 15% of income. And the bottom 80% have about 40% of income. Did I say, well, I'm sorry, when I said income before I meant wealth. The bottom, so let me just say it clearly once, the bottom 80% of families have about 15% of wealth, and the bottom 80% of families have about 40% of income. Now finally, let me show you some information about income share trends in the U.S. So what these pictures show are, well, I'll just describe it. So literally the blue one here shows the share of income earned by the top 10% of families, and the red one shows the share of income earned by the top 5% of families by income. So what it says in 1930 or so, the top 10% of families had almost 50% of income. The top 5% had about 38, something like that, percent of income. Now as we moved out of the sort of roaring 20s and the Great Depression into World War II, we had this period when the top 10% of families had about 35% of income. It was pretty stable from about 1940 till about 1980. And the top 5% of families between the Second World War and about 1980 had about 25% of income. Since 1980, we've really had a rather stark change. The top 10% of families has gone from having 35 to now having about 50%. So we're back where we were in about 1930. The top 5% of families has gone from having about 25% to about, well, almost 40%. Right? So really a pretty radical change at the upper end of the income distribution. So the top 10 and top 5% of the income distribution in the U.S., those folks garner now a lot more of a higher share of income than they used to. It's also a lot more income, but it's a higher share as well. We can look at this as well for higher points in the distribution. So this is the top 1% and top half of 1%. The top 1% in blue was about 25% of income in 1930. It was stable between World War II and 1980, around 10%, has since risen to about 20 to 23%. Top 0.5% shows very much the same pattern, of course a slightly lower level. We can also see this at the top 1/10 of 1% and 1/100th of 1%. So again, just to put it in words, in 1930, the top 1/10 of 1% of families had a little over 10% of income, and then this fell to about 4%. Since 1980, it's risen to over 10%. And similar patterns are evident in the top 1/100th of 1%. Now again, this is income, not wealth. All right. Why am I showing you this? Well, when these things change a lot, it's one thing to say there are some people who have more stuff than others, and of course that's always true. But it is important to note, for students in an economics class, that the world's been changing a lot in the last generation or so. And I think it is true that sometimes income inequality doesn't end well, and this sort of a fun perspective on this is to think about, Versailles and guillotines. But in a more contemporary, so by the way, this is the Palace Versailles outside Paris, and this is the backyard, this is the Hall of Mirrors, and here we have Marie Antoinette and Louis, I forget which Louis that is, but here's a guillotine. More to the point though, the last few years we've seen lots of policy talk about the distribution of income, the Occupy movement and even the recent presidential campaign. So it's being discussed a lot again because there really have been big changes, and you should just be aware of those. All right, what are some takeaways? Well, as we said at the outset, first of all, income and wealth distributions are unequal. No surprise there. Different people have different amounts of stuff. Wealth distributions are far more unequal than income distributions because, again, we accumulate, those of us who have a bunch accumulate and give it to our kids. And finally, I think maybe the most sort of current interesting fact here, the U.S. distributions have grown more unequal over the past 25 years. We saw these really stark changes since 1980 in the share of income generated or accruing to the top 10 and 5 and 1, et cetera, % of U.S. families.